I have lived longer than most in this village, long enough to watch houses rise and fall, rice fields flood and dry, faces turn to bone and long enough to learn that not everything that dies stays buried. Before I tell you about my experience, I want to thank the people who are taking the time out to listen to an old lady's life story. We lived quietly in those years back in the 40s. No electricity, no machines to drown out the night sounds, just the oil lamps flickering behind our shutters, the cicadas singing their endless songs, and the river breathing outside our doors. Life was plain then, predictable, almost comforting in its sameness. But comfort can blind you to danger. I thought I understood this place. I thought I knew which paths were safe to walk in the darkness, which shadows belonged to the mango trees, which voices belonged to neighbors calling their children home. I was young then, barely 23, with smooth hands and a back that didn't ache when the rains came. I was foolish. I was wrong. There was something else here, waiting in the dark places where the moonlight couldn't reach. And once I saw it, once it saw me, nothing was ever the same. I was a wife then and a mother to three small children. My days belonged to the endless rhythm of village life, cooking rice over the wood fire, gathering water from the river in clay jars, tending to the flames that kept the mosquitoes at bay. My husband worked the rice fields from dawn until the sun hung low and orange in the sky, returning home with mud caked on his legs and exhaustion etched deep in the lines around his eyes. My children played barefoot under the stilted houses during the day, chasing chickens and splashing in the shallow places where the river curved close to our home. The youngest was still nursing, barely 6 months old, with fat cheeks and eyes that followed everything with the wonder that only babies possess. The middle child, a boy of 3, had my husband's stubborn streak and my mother's gift for finding trouble in the safest places. And my eldest, a daughter of 5, already helped me carry the smaller water jars and watched her brothers with the serious expression of someone who understood responsibility too young. The village was small, maybe 30 families scattered along the riverbank like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Everyone's lives were woven together like the bamboo mats we slept on. Women gathered by the river each morning to wash clothes, their laughter carrying across the water as they shared gossip and worries in equal measure. The monks walked through our village each dawn with their alms bowls, and we offered rice with bowed heads, grateful for their blessings. Children ran freely between houses, knowing they would find a meal at any door, a lap to sit on, a story told in the shade of any veranda. The old men gathered in the evenings to smoke and play cards made from pressed palm leaves, while the old women shared betel nut and discussed whose daughter was ready for marriage, whose son showed promise in the fields. It was the kind of life that changes slowly, like the river wearing down stones, so gradual you don't notice until you look back and see how different everything has become. But there were rhythms we all followed, boundaries we all respected without being told, rules passed down from our grandmothers and their grandmothers before them. And the most important rule was this: never trust the river after dark. The old ones had always warned us about the river at night. They whispered of spirits that clung to its banks, the restless dead, the ones who had drowned in its depths, the ones taken before their time. They spoke of women who had thrown themselves into the water when their hearts were broken, of children who had wandered too close and been pulled under by currents that seemed gentle in daylight but turned hungry when the sun disappeared. Don't look too long into its black surface, my grandmother used to say, her voice sharp with fear that had been passed down through generations. Don't listen to voices that call from the water. Don't follow lights that dance above the reeds. The river remembers everything that has died in it, and sometimes it wants company. We all nodded and made the proper sounds of agreement. But most of us, those of us who were young and busy with living, dismissed it as superstition, old women's tales meant to keep children from wandering and to give meaning to the random cruelties that life sometimes delivered. I wish now that I had listened more. I wish I had understood that some superstitions exist because terrible things have happened before, and the stories we tell are the only armor we have against their happening again. The signs began on a night when the monsoon rains had been falling for 3 days straight. The sky hung low and heavy, pressing down on our village like a wet blanket. The air smelled of mud and growing things, that rich scent of earth drinking deeply after a long thirst. I had gone down to the river to fetch water for the evening meal. My husband would be returning soon from the fields, his clothes soaked and his stomach empty. The children were restless from being kept inside, and my youngest had been fussing all day with the kind of crying that tells a mother something is not right with the world, even if she can't name what it is. The path to the river was slippery with mud and fallen leaves. I carried the oil lamp in one hand and the water jar balanced on my hip, walking carefully to avoid the roots that lay hidden under puddles of rainwater. The air was thick enough to drink, and my hair stuck to my neck despite being pulled back and covered with a cloth. When I reached the river bank, I could hear the water moving faster than usual, swollen with rain from the mountains. It made a different sound than the gentle murmur we were used to, hungrier, more urgent, like something trying to speak but unable to form words. I crouched at the water's edge, setting the lamp on a flat stone and lowering the jar into the current. The water was cloudy with stirred mud, but it would settle once I carried it home and let it sit in the large clay vessel by our door. That's when I heard it. A sound that made my hands stop moving, made my breath catch in my throat. Not the splash of a fish jumping, not the rustle of water against the reeds. It was a cry, soft, small, heartbroken in a way that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. A child's cry, but wrong somehow, like an echo that has traveled too far and lost part of itself along the way. I lifted the lamp higher, peering into the darkness beyond its small circle of light. The rain had gentled to a whisper, and for a moment the world held its breath. That's when I saw her. A woman stood waist deep in the water, perhaps 20 feet from where I knelt. Her hair floated around her shoulders like dark silk, moving with the current, but somehow too fluid, too graceful for the choppy water. Her skin was pale as moonlight on rice paddies, and she wore a white dress that seemed to glow against the black water. In her arms she held something small and still and precious. Something that didn't move despite her gentle swaying, despite the way she rocked back and forth as if trying to soothe whatever she carried. I blinked, trying to clear the rain from my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. When I looked again, the river was empty. Only ripples remained, spreading out in perfect circles as if something had just disturbed the surface. But the crying continued, fainter now, seeming to come from all directions at once. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks, the storm, the dim light, the tiredness that comes from caring for 3 small children in a household. These things could make anyone see shapes and shadows, hear voices in the wind. I filled my jar quickly and turned back toward the path, eager to return to the warm light of home. But as I climbed the muddy slope, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched, of someone walking just behind me, matching their steps to mine. I could hear the soft whisper of wet fabric against skin, could smell something that didn't belong to the storm. The sweet, cloying scent of frangipani blossoms, heavy and almost too rich to breathe. I walked faster, my heart beating loud enough that I was sure whoever followed could hear it. The lamp swayed in my hand, throwing wild shadows that seemed to dance and reach for me. But I didn't look back. Something deep in my bones told me that turning around would be the worst thing I could do, that some sights are meant to stay hidden in the darkness. When I reached my house, I climbed the wooden steps quickly and shut the door firmly behind me, dropping the heavy wooden bar across it. My husband looked up from where he sat, mending a fishing net, his eyebrows raised at my haste. The rain's getting worse, I told him, setting down the water jar with hands that shook only slightly. Nearly slipped on the path. He nodded and returned to his work, and I busied myself with preparing the evening meal. But I could still smell the frangipani, faint but persistent, even inside our home, with its familiar sense of wood smoke and drying herbs. And all through dinner, even as my children chattered and my husband told me about his day in the fields, I found myself listening for something else, a soft crying that might drift through the walls, a gentle tapping at our door. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain drumming against our roof. My husband slept soundly beside me, and the children were quiet in their corner of the room where they slept on mats spread over bamboo frames. But sleep wouldn't come to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale figure standing in the water, saw the way her hair moved like something alive and hungry, and I kept smelling flowers where no flowers grew. The disturbances began in earnest after that. Small things at first, the kind of things you might dismiss if you were determined not to believe. The dogs in our village started acting strangely. These were working dogs, used to hardship and practical about threats. But night after night, they would gather near the river and bark into the darkness, their hackles raised and their voices high with fear. Not the deep warning barks they gave to strangers or wild animals, but something higher, more desperate, like the sound scared children make when they can't find words for what frightens them. My youngest child began waking in the middle of the night, crying inconsolably. Not the usual fussing of a baby who is hungry or needs changing, but the kind of terrified screaming that makes a mother's heart race. When I would lift him from his sleeping mat, he would point toward the door and babble in the urgent way babies do when they're trying to communicate something important. His eyes would be wide and tracking something I couldn't see, following movement across our walls that existed only for him. My middle son, the 3-year-old, started talking about the lady by the way she calls my name. He would tell me, his small face serious and worried. She wants me to come play with her baby. But her baby doesn't move, Mama. Why doesn't her baby move? When I asked him what lady, he would point toward the river and describe her exactly as I had seen her: pale skin, floating hair, white dress that glowed in the darkness. But children have vivid imaginations, I told myself. They dream in colors and sounds that adults have forgotten. And sometimes those dreams leak into their waking hours. My husband dismissed these things with the practical certainty of someone whose world has no room for mysteries. The dog smells something in the forest, he would say. A tiger, maybe, or wild boar, the baby's teething, that's why he cries. And boys that age always imagine playmates, it's natural. But I noticed he stopped walking alone to check the fish traps in the evening. I noticed he made sure our door was barred before full darkness fell, and that he kept his long knife closer to hand than usual. The flowers were what convinced me I wasn't imagining things. Every evening when the sun set and the first stars appeared, the scent would begin: frangipani blossoms, sweet and heavy, drifting through our house like incense. It would start faintly, just a whisper of perfume that made you think of temple ceremonies and funeral rites. But as the night grew deeper, it would become stronger, thick enough to taste, until I felt like I was drowning in sweetness. There were no frangipani trees near our house. The closest grew in the temple grounds, a half-day's walk upriver, and these bloomed only in the hot season. This was the rainy time, when the air should have smelled of mud and growing rice, of wet wood and the green smell of jungle plants drinking deeply. My grandmother had told me once when I was very young that spirits announce themselves with flowers. When you smell blossoms where there are none, she had said, her old eyes sharp and knowing, it is not a blessing. It is a sign something dead is trying to return to the world of the living, and flowers are the bridge they use to cross over. I had thought it was just another old woman's tale. Now I understood it was a warning. The night everything changed, I was nursing my youngest child when the wooden cradle began to sway. Not the natural rocking that babies love, but something else, a slow, deliberate movement, as if pushed by hands I couldn't see. I watched, frozen as the cradle moved back and forth in perfect rhythm, continuing even after my son had finished nursing and fallen asleep in my. The movement was gentle but persistent, hypnotic in its steadiness, and I found myself counting the beats like a heartbeat, like a lullaby made of motion instead of sound. My older children slept peacefully on their mats, undisturbed by what I was witnessing. My husband's breathing remained deep and even beside me. The house was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds: wood settling, rain pattering on the roof, the river murmuring in the distance. But the cradle kept moving. With each sway, the scent of frangipani grew stronger until I could barely breathe for the sweetness of it. That's when I knew she was there, standing just outside the reach of the oil lamp's light, watching, waiting, making her presence known in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I held my baby closer and whispered every prayer my grandmother had taught me, every blessing the monks had shared during the water ceremonies. But the cradle kept moving, and the flowers kept blooming invisible around us. And somewhere in the darkness beyond my vision, something that had once been a woman was learning the rhythm of my household, studying the patterns of our sleep, measuring the distance between desire and desperation. The next evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of avoiding the river, instead of sending someone else to fetch water, I chose to go myself. I told myself I needed to see with my own eyes, to prove once and for all that my mind was playing tricks on me, that grief and exhaustion and too many old stories were conspiring to make me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I think I knew better. I think some part of me understood that she was calling me, that this confrontation was inevitable, that running from what I had seen would only delay a reckoning that was already written in the stars. I waited until my children were settled for the night and my husband had gone to check on the animals one final time. Then I took my water jar and my oil lamp and walked down to the river alone, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The night was clear for the first time in weeks. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool, full of the sounds of insects and night birds celebrating the return of dry weather. Stars reflected on the water's surface like scattered coins, and a half moon hung low above the tree line, painting everything in silver and shadow. I knelt at the water's edge and set my lamp on the same flat stone as before, but instead of filling my jar and hurrying home, I waited. I listened, and I watched the dark water flow past, carrying with it all the secrets it had collected over the years. She came as I knew she would. First, I saw ripples moving against the current, spreading outward from some disturbance I couldn't identify. Then the water began to glow faintly, as if lit from below by sunken lanterns. And finally, she rose from the depths like a memory made flesh, water streaming from her hair and clothes, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my soul contract. She was exactly as I remembered, pale skin that seemed to generate its own light, dark hair that moved with impossible grace, a white dress that clung to her thin frame like burial cloth. But this time I could see her face clearly, and what I saw there made my blood turn to ice water. She had been beautiful once. The bones of her face spoke of elegance, of laughter shared in sunlight, of love given and received. But death had changed her, had carved away everything soft and human, leaving only hunger and longing and a terrible, consuming need. In her arms, she cradled what had once been a child. Its skin was gray white like fish belly, its limbs hanging loose and unnatural. Its head lolled to one side, revealing a neck bent at an angle that spoke of violence, of lives cut short by cruelty or carelessness, or simple random misfortune. She looked at me with eyes that held all the sorrow in the world, and when she spoke, her voice was like wind through empty houses, like water flowing over stones worn smooth by endless years. "Take him," she said, and the words seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the water, from the trees, from the very air around me. "Take him and let me rest." But there was something wrong with the words, something that made my skin crawl, even as part of me wanted to reach out, wanted to ease the suffering I saw in her ghostly features. The request sounded simple, compassionate even, a mother asking for help with her child, a spirit seeking peace through a simple act of kindness. But my grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, urgent and afraid. "Never take anything offered by the dead. Never accept their gifts. Never agree to their bargains. The spirits who linger are those who died with unfinished business, and they will use any living person to complete what death interrupted." As I watched, frozen between pity and terror, the woman took a step closer to the riverbank. The dead child in her arms seemed to shift, and for a moment I could have sworn its eyes opened black and empty as wells, but somehow aware, somehow hungry. "Take him," she repeated, and this time her voice carried a note of command, of impatience barely held in check. "Take him, and I will give you peace. Take him, and your troubles will end. Take him, and your husband will return safely from the fields every night. Your children will grow strong and wise. Your rice will never fail." The promises hung in the air like bait, each one carefully chosen to appeal to the fears that lived in every mother's heart. Who among us didn't worry about our husbands during the dangerous season when the floods came and the currents grew strong? Who didn't lie awake wondering if our children would live to see adulthood, if the rains would come in time to save the crops, if tomorrow would bring joy or sorrow to our door? But even as part of me yearned to believe her words, to accept the bargain she offered, I understood with crystal clarity what was really happening. She wasn't offering to take my troubles away. She was offering to trade them, my living child for her dead one, my family's future for her past's resolution. "No," I whispered, clutching my water jar like armor. "No, I won't take him. No, I won't take him." Her face twisted with rage, so sudden and complete it was like watching lightning split the sky. The water around her began to churn and foam, and the temperature dropped so quickly I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. "Then you will lose what you refuse to trade," she hissed, her voice now like breaking glass, like screams trapped in ice. "If you will not take the dead will take from you. Balance must be maintained, mother. The river always collects what it is owed." I ran then, not the careful, measured retreat I had planned, but a wild, desperate flight up the muddy path, my lamp swinging wildly and throwing crazy shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. Behind me, I could hear her following, not footsteps, but something worse, the sound of water flowing uphill, of wetness spreading where it had no right to be. The scent of frangipani choked the air so thick I gagged on its sweetness, and underneath that cloying perfume was something else, the smell of river mud and decay, of things that had been underwater too long, of flesh that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. I burst through my door and barred it behind me, breathing hard and shaking like a leaf in a storm wind. My husband woke at the sound of my entrance, sitting up quickly with the alertness of someone used to danger. What happened? He asked, already reaching for his knife. Nothing, I lied, not wanting to burden him with a truth he wouldn't believe anyway. I thought I heard something by the river, probably just an animal. But even as I spoke the words, I could feel her presence pressing against the walls of our house like flood water. And I knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't give up, that she would find a way to claim what she felt she was owed, that my refusal had only delayed an accounting that was as inevitable as the sunrise. I should have left then. I should have packed what we could carry and taken my family away from that place, far from the river and its hungry memories. But where could we have gone? This was our home, our livelihood, our world. My husband's fields were here, my children's friends, my own mother's grave in the small cemetery behind the Besides, I told myself, surely she would grow tired of waiting. Surely she would find some other way to achieve the peace she sought, some other family to burden with her terrible. Spirits were impatient creatures, according to the old stories. They raged and threatened and then faded away when their first attempts at revenge failed to satisfy them. I was wrong about that, too. For the next week, our house became a battleground between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond the veil of death. Every night brought new manifestations of her presence, each one more bold and frightening than the last. She would scratch at our door with fingernails that sounded like claws on wood. She would whisper my children's names through the gaps in the walls, her voice sweet as honey, promising games and treats if they would just step outside to play. She would make the wooden floors creak as if she paced back and forth, planning, considering, measuring our defenses against her growing desperation. The smell of frangipani became constant, so thick that food began to taste of flowers, so persistent that my youngest child developed a cough that wouldn't go away. My older children stopped playing during the day, instead huddling close to me and speaking in whispers, as if afraid that normal voices might attract her attention and the lullaby. Every night, just as the oil lamps began to flicker low and sleep should have claimed us, she would begin to sing. At first, the melody was sweet and gentle, the kind of song a loving mother might use to soothe a fretful baby. But as the hours passed, the tune would change, becoming discordant, then mocking, then openly threatening. The words, when I could make them out, were a corruption of a traditional children's song about a mother duck leading her babies to water. But in her version, the babies never returned to shore, and the mother duck spent eternity swimming in circles, calling for children who could no longer answer. The night of the final confrontation, she grew bold enough to enter our house. I was sitting up with my youngest, who had been crying inconsolably for hours. Nothing I did seemed to comfort him, not nursing, not rocking, not the gentle songs my own mother had used to soothe me when I was small. He would quiet for a moment, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger. But then his eyes would fix on some point beyond my shoulder, and he would begin screaming again, his voice high and sharp with terror. My husband paced the floor, his own nerves frayed by nights of interrupted sleep and the growing tension that seemed to press down on our household like a physical weight. Maybe we should take him to the temple, he suggested for the third time. Let the monks say prayers, drive away whatever evil spirits are troubling him. I nodded, though I knew it wouldn't help. This wasn't about evil spirits in the general sense. This was personal, specific, directed at our family with surgical precision. That's when the lullaby began again, but this time it wasn't coming from outside our walls. It was coming from inside the house, soft and lilting and impossibly close. We both froze, listening. The melody seemed to drift from the corners where the lamplight couldn't reach, weaving around the wooden posts that supported our roof, curling through the spaces between the bamboo slats like smoke. My baby stopped crying abruptly, his head turning toward the darkest corner of the room with the focused attention that infants usually reserve for bright colors or moving objects. A smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile I had seen from him in days. And that's when I saw her. She stood in the corner where the wall met the floor, her pale form barely visible against the wooden planks, but unmistakably there. Her hair dripped constantly, leaving dark stains that spread across the floor like spilled ink. In her arms, the dead child looked more real than before, its gray skin taking on a waxy sheen, its empty eye socket somehow managing to convey intelligence, hunger, malicious intent. She was looking at my baby, and he was looking back with the trusting innocence that only children possess. Between them, I could feel something building, a connection, a recognition, a terrible understanding that bypassed all rational thought and spoke directly to the parts of the soul that existed before language, before civilization, before we learned to pretend that death was an ending rather than a transformation. Take him, she said again, but this time she wasn't speaking to me, she was speaking to my child, and he was listening with the rapt attention he usually reserved for his father's voice or his sister's. The dead thing in her arms began to move, slowly raising one gray hand as if reaching for my baby. Its fingers were too long, too thin, ending in what looked like claws rather than fingernails. And when it opened its mouth, God help me, I could see rows of tiny, sharp teeth like a fish's mouth, designed for tearing rather than nursing. Take him, she repeated, and I realized she had changed tactics. Instead of trying to force me to accept her burden, she was offering her dead child directly to mine, bypassing my maternal protection through the simple expedient of appealing to infant curiosity. My baby reached out his own tiny hand, fingers grasping at the air, trying to touch the thing that called to him with promises I couldn't hear but could see reflected in his delighted expression. That's when I found my voice again. Not the whispered prayers or desperate denials I had been offering, but something deeper and more powerful, the voice every mother discovers when her child is threatened, the sound that can stop predators in their tracks and move mountains through sheer force of will. No, I shouted, pulling my baby tight against my chest and turning my body to shield him from her reaching dead thing. You cannot have him. He is mine. He is alive. He belongs to this world and not yours. She hissed like a serpent, her face contorting with rage that was ancient and implacable. Black water began to pour from her mouth, pooling on our wooden floor and filling the air with the stench of river bottom and rotting vegetation. Then you will pay another price, she snarled, her voice now like the sound of drowning, like the last breath leaving dying lungs. If you will not trade willingly, the river will take what it is owed. Balance must be maintained, mother. The dead will have their due. The temperature plummeted so quickly that ice began to form on the water she had dripped, frost spreading across our walls despite the humid heat of the season. My breath came out in white puffs, and my children began to shiver in their sleep without waking. She lunged toward us then, her dead child reaching out with those terrible claws, but I was ready. I had been preparing for this moment all week, gathering every scrap of protection my grandmother's stories had taught me. I threw handful after handful of blessed rice at her, shouting every prayer I knew, calling on every protective spirit our family had ever honored. The rice sizzled when it touched her skin, sending up steam that smelled like burning hair. She screamed, a sound like breaking glass, like the cries of all the mothers who had ever lost children to the river's hunger and began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible. But her final words hung in the air like a curse, like a promise written in blood. The river always collects what it is owed. I thought my prayers and my determination and my maternal fierceness had been enough to drive her away permanently. I thought that clinging to my child, refusing her dark bargain, protecting my family with every tool my ancestors had left me would be sufficient to end the nightmare. I was wrong. Spirits, you see, don't give up easily. They don't forget slights or abandon their purposes simply because their first attempts fail. They are patient in ways that living people can barely comprehend, persistent beyond any earthly determination. And when they cannot take what they want directly, they find other ways to balance the cosmic scales they believe govern existence. A week passed in blessed quiet. The frangipani smell faded from our house, replaced by the normal sense of cooking and living. The dogs stopped barking at shadows, and my children began to play again, their laughter echoing under the stilted houses like music. My youngest baby returned to his normal pattern of eating and sleeping, no longer startled by invisible presences or reaching for things that shouldn't exist. I allowed myself to hope that it was over, that she had finally accepted defeat and moved on to whatever realm awaited spirits who could not find peace in their earthly attachments. I began to sleep through the night again, to walk to the river for water without looking over my shoulder, to believe that the worst was behind us. My husband seemed happier too, humming old songs as he prepared his tools each morning, kissing me goodbye with the easy affection of someone whose world had returned to its proper balance. He spoke of expanding our rice fields, of perhaps building a larger house now that our family was growing, of all the ordinary dreams that make life worth living. You see, he told me on the seventh morning of peace, adjusting his hat against the early sun. It was all just bad dreams and imagination. Spirits are like storms. They seem terrible while they're happening, but they always pass if you wait long enough. And I should have known better. I should have understood that the calm was not resolution, but preparation. Not victory, but the quiet that comes before the final devastating blow. That afternoon, my husband did not come home from the fields. At first, I told myself he had simply stayed late to finish some task, or stopped to help a neighbor whose work had fallen behind, or decided to check the fish traps before the sun set completely. These were all normal things, reasonable explanations for why a hardworking man might be delayed on his journey home. But as the sky darkened and the evening meal grew cold on the mat, I felt the familiar twist of fear beginning in my stomach, the same sensation I had learned to associate with her presence. When the night sounds began, the insects and frogs and owls that marked the transition from day to darkness, and he still had not appeared, I knew something was wrong. I fed the children and put them to bed, telling them their father had decided to sleep in the field shelter to guard the crops from wild animals. It was a reasonable story, one that wouldn't frighten them, but I could see the doubt in my eldest daughter's eyes, the way she glanced toward the door every few minutes as if willing him to appear. I sat up all night listening for his footsteps on the wooden stairs, for his voice calling out to let me know he was safe. But the only sounds that came to me were the usual night chorus, and once, just before dawn, the faint melody of a lullaby drifting up from the direction of the river. When the sun rose and he still had not returned, I asked my oldest neighbor to watch the children and set out to find him. The path to our rice fields was familiar, worn smooth by years of daily travel. But that morning, every shadow seemed ominous. Every rustle in the grass felt like a warning. I found his hat first. It lay beside the irrigation canal that fed water to our terrace plots, soaked through and torn as if something had grabbed it violently. The straw was shredded. The careful weaving my own hands had done months earlier, now destroyed beyond repair. His footprints led to the edge of the canal and then simply stopped. Not gradually, as if he had walked into the water and been swept away, but abruptly, as if he had been standing there one moment and gone the next. The mud around the water's edge was disturbed, churned up as if there had been a struggle, but there were no other prints, no signs of the wild animals or human attackers that might explain his disappearance. Just the smell of frangipani, heavy and cloying, even though no such flowers bloomed anywhere near the rice fields. I searched for 3 days, 3 days of walking every path he might have taken, checking every shelter where he might have sought refuge, asking every neighbor if they had seen him pass. The other men from our village joined the search, spreading out across the countryside like fingers of a desperate hand, calling his name until their voices grew hoarse. We found nothing. No body in the water, no signs of violence, no trace of the gentle man who had kissed me goodbye just days earlier with promises of returning before sunset. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed him, leaving behind only that torn hat and the memory of his laughter. The village elders gathered on the fourth day, their faces grave with the kind of sorrow that comes from seeing too many unexplained disappearances over the years. They spoke in low voices of the river's hunger, of the debts that spirits demanded, of the terrible mathematics that govern the balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Sometimes the oldest among them told me, his weathered hands gentle on my shoulders, the spirits take what they need to restore harmony. It is not cruelty, child. It is simply the way things are, the way they have always been. The river gives life to our crops, but sometimes it demands payment for its gifts. I wanted to scream at him, to rage against his calm acceptance of my loss, to demand that he explain how the disappearance of my husband could possibly serve any greater purpose. But I knew the truth, even if I couldn't speak it aloud. I knew exactly why my husband had been taken, exactly whose hunger had been satisfied by his absence. She had kept her word. When I refused her trade, when I would not accept her dead child in exchange for my living one, she had found another way to balance the scales. If she could not have a life to replace the one she had lost, she would take a life to ease her suffering. If I would not willingly participate in her twisted mathematics of exchange, she would force the equation to balance through other means. The funeral was held without a body, according to the customs for those who were lost to the water. We floated offerings on banana leaves, his favorite foods, small possessions that had belonged to him, prayers written on strips of palm leaf that dissolved slowly in the current. The monks chanted for his spirit's peaceful journey to the next realm, and the women of the village wailed the traditional songs of mourning. But I could not cry. Not yet. The grief was too large, too complete. Like a wound that goes so deep the body goes numb to protect itself from the full magnitude of the damage. I stood by the river's edge, watching the offerings disappear downstream, and felt only a terrible emptiness where my heart used to be. My children asked when their father would come home. I told them he had gone on a long journey and would not be returning, but they were too young to fully understand what that meant. They waited for him anyway, running to the door whenever they heard footsteps on the path, saving portions of their evening meals in case he returned hungry and tired. The hardest part was not the grief itself, but the knowledge of its cause. If I had been stronger, if I had found some other way to appease the river spirit, if I had been willing to make the sacrifice she demanded, my husband might still be alive. My children might still have a father, and I might not be facing the terrifying prospect of raising them alone in a world that offered few protections for widows. But even in my darkest moments, I could not regret protecting my baby. Whatever the cost, however high the price she demanded for my refusal, I could not imagine a universe in which trading my living child for her dead one would have been the right choice. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. Without my husband's labor in the fields, without his expertise in managing the crops and maintaining the irrigation channels, our family's fortunes declined rapidly. The rice harvest was poor that year, yielding barely enough to feed us through the dry season with nothing left over to sell or trade. I took on whatever work I could find, washing clothes for families with more prosperity than time, helping with harvests on neighboring farms, weaving baskets and mats to sell at the weekly market in the next village over. My hands, which had been soft and clean when I was a properly married woman, became rough and stained with the evidence of constant labor. My children helped as much as they. My eldest daughter, barely 6 years old, learned to tend the cooking fire and watch her younger brothers while I worked. The 3-year-old gathered eggs from our few chickens and helped me carry water from the river, though I never let him go to the water's edge alone, never let any of them venture near that place without my constant supervision. The baby grew thin despite my efforts to nurse him adequately. The stress and poor nutrition were affecting my milk supply, and I often went hungry myself so that the older children could have larger portions of our meager meals. But he survived, my youngest son, as if something deep in his tiny body understood that his very existence was the reason for all our troubles, and that he owed it to the world to justify the price we had paid for his protection. Other families in the village helped when they could, sharing rice when their harvests were good, including us in community meals during festivals, making sure we had warm clothes when the cool. But there was only so much assistance they could offer without endangering their own family's welfare. And always, always there was the awareness that she was still out, still watching, still waiting. I never saw her again directly, but I felt her presence like a weight on my shoulders, like eyes watching from dark places. Sometimes, when I went to the river for water, I would catch glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision, a pale shape that disappeared when I turned to look directly, ripples that moved against the current, the shadow of someone standing where no one should be. The dog still avoided the riverbank at night, and children in the village began to have the same kinds of dreams my son had experienced, visions of a pale woman with a dead baby, promises of games and treats if they would just step outside and follow her into the darkness. I know, but she seemed to have spent her immediate fury in taking my husband. The active haunting stopped, replaced by this quieter, more persistent form of menace. It was as if she had achieved enough balance to satisfy her immediate hunger, but not enough to grant her true peace. She remained tethered to our world, watching and waiting for the next opportunity to tip the scales further in her favor. Years passed. My children grew up fatherless but not unloved, shaped by hardship but not broken by it. My daughter became the kind of young woman who could manage a household with the efficiency of someone twice her age, serious and capable and protective of her younger brothers. My middle son developed the cautious wisdom of a child who had learned early that the world contained dangers that adults couldn't always see or prevent. And my youngest, the baby whose life had cost his father's, grew into a boy with unusually keen instincts about which paths were safe to walk and which shadows contained more than absence of light. I never remarried, though there were men in our village and the surrounding area who might have been willing to take on a widow with children. Part of it was practical. What did I have to offer a husband besides extra mouths to feed and the constant struggle to make ends meet? But part of it was something deeper, a superstition I could never quite shake. What if she was still watching? What if the presence of another man in our house, another father figure for my children, would trigger her hunger again? What if she saw a new husband as a fresh opportunity for the kind of trade she had originally proposed? A living man for her dead child, a functional family for her broken one. I couldn't take that risk. I couldn't bear the thought of losing someone else to her terrible mathematics of exchange, and I couldn't bear the thought of my children losing another father to satisfy a ghost's endless grieving. So I raised them alone with the help of neighbors and the strength that comes from having no other choice. I taught them everything my grandmother had taught me about recognizing the signs of spiritual presence, about protecting themselves with prayers and blessed objects, about the difference between superstition. And I taught them never to make bargains with the dead, no matter how reasonable the terms might seem, no matter how much they might gain or how little they thought they had to lose. The spirits who linger, I would tell them, repeating my grandmother's words, are those who died with unfinished business, and they will use any living person to complete what death interrupted. Their unfinished business is never simple, never clean, never truly finished. It just spreads like ripples in water until it touches everyone. But the story doesn't end there, because spirits, as I said, are patient beyond human understanding, and their hungers don't diminish with time. If anything, they grow stronger, more focused, more desperately creative in their methods. 20 years passed after my husband's disappearance. 20 years of peace, more or less, though I never fully relaxed my vigilance. My children became adults, found spouses of their own, built houses of their own along the same riverbank that had claimed their father. My daughter married a good man from the next village over and gave me grandchildren who played under the same stilted houses where their mother had played. My middle son became a skilled fisherman and farmer, respected for his hard work and practical wisdom. And my youngest, the baby whose life had started all our troubles, grew up to become the village's most gifted craftsman, able to build boats and houses and furniture with an artistry that seemed to flow directly from his hands to the wood. I was a grandmother by then, gray-haired and bent with arthritis, but still strong enough to help with the child rearing and household tasks that fill an extended family's days. The terrible years of poverty and struggle were behind us. We had rebuilt our prosperity through decades of careful work, and the family felt secure again, rooted in the rhythms of village life. That's when she returned. It started as it had before with the children. My eldest granddaughter, a bright 5-year-old with her father's stubborn streak and her mother's quick laugh, began talking about the lady by the water who wanted to show her something special. She has a baby, my granddaughter told me one afternoon as we shelled peas together on the veranda. But the baby doesn't move, grandmother. She says I could help her make it move again if I want to. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making my hand shake so violently that peas scattered across the bamboo floor. 20 years of preparation, 20 years of vigilance, and still I had not been ready to hear those particular words spoken in that innocent voice. What lady? I asked, though I already knew the answer, had always known this day would eventually come. The one with the white dress who smells like the flowers at the temple, my granddaughter said matter-of-factly. She comes when Mama and Papa are working, when you're taking your afternoon rest. She stands in the water and sings the prettiest songs, grandmother. She says, if I help her, she'll teach me to sing like that too. I gathered my granddaughter into my arms, holding her close while my mind raced through everything I knew about the spirit's patterns, everything I had learned about her methods and motivations. She had waited 20 years, an eye blink of time, for something that no longer lived in the normal flow of days and seasons. She had waited for my children to have children of their own, for the family to grow comfortable and unguarded again. And now she was back, using the same tactics she had tried with my own son 2 decades earlier, but this time she wasn't trying to trade her dead child for my living one. This time she was offering something subtly different, the promise of partnership rather than exchange, the suggestion that my granddaughter could help rather than simply surrender. It was a more sophisticated approach, one that spoke to the way her understanding of human nature had evolved during her long years of waiting and watching. Instead of demanding a sacrifice, she was proposing collaboration. Instead of threatening loss, she was promising enhancement. Instead of trying to force a trade, she was offering to make my granddaughter special, gifted, chosen. But the underlying hunger remained the same. She wanted a living child to replace her dead one, and she was willing to be patient, clever, and manipulative to achieve that goal. I spent the next 3 days teaching my granddaughter every protective prayer I knew, giving her a blessed amulet to wear around her neck, explaining in terms a 5-year-old could understand that some spirits pretend to be friendly but are actually very dangerous. But she seems so sad, grandmother, my granddaughter protested, and her baby is so still and quiet. Don't you think we should help them? The question broke my heart because it revealed exactly why this approach was so insidious. So, my granddaughter's compassion, her natural instinct to help someone in distress, was being weaponized against her. The spirit wasn't appealing to greed or curiosity or even simple childish disobedience. She was appealing to kindness, to the generous impulse that made my granddaughter the kind of child who brought injured birds into the house and shared her food with hungry dogs. Sometimes, little one, I told her, the kindest thing we can do is to leave some problems for adults to solve. Some troubles are too big for children, too dangerous for people who don't understand all the rules that go. But I could see in her eyes that the explanation wasn't entirely satisfactory, that part of her still wondered if we might be abandoning someone who genuinely needed our help. And I knew that doubt would make her vulnerable, would give the spirit an opening to exploit. The confrontation, when it came, was different this time. 20 years of experience had taught me to be more proactive, less willing to wait and see how events would unfold. Instead of letting the spirit build her influence over my granddaughter gradually, I decided to meet the threat directly. I waited until the rest of the family was occupied with evening tasks, then took my granddaughter's hand and walked down to the river. Not to fetch water this time, but to have the conversation that had been inevitable since the moment my granddaughter first mentioned the lady in white. She was there, of course, standing in the same place where I had first seen her decades earlier, looking exactly as she had then, pale, ethereal, tragic in her eternal mourning. The dead child in her arms seemed more solid this time, more real, as if her years of haunting had somehow given it greater substance. But I was different too. No longer the young mother paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, but an old woman who had already lost everything she could afford to lose, who had survived the worst things she could imagine and found ways to rebuild a meaningful life from the wreckage. I know what you want, I called out to her, not bothering with the polite circumlocutions that might have characterized our earlier encounters. And I know why you're here, but the answer is the same as it was 20 years ago. You cannot have her. She turned toward me with that fluid, impossible grace that marked her as something that no longer obeyed the ordinary laws of physics. Her eyes, when they met mine, held a kind of recognition, not just of my face, but of my resolve, my willingness to fight the same battle over again if necessary. You took my husband, I continued, my voice steady despite the fear that always accompanied her presence. You took the father of my children because I wouldn't give you what you demanded. But it didn't satisfy you, did it? It didn't give you what you really needed. For the first time in all our encounters, she spoke without being prompted, without waiting for me to make demands or ask questions. Nothing satisfies, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of frustrated longing. Nothing fills the emptiness where my child should be. I have tried taking life to balance the life that was taken from me, but it only creates more emptiness, more hunger. The scales never balance, Mother. They only tip further toward despair. The admission startled me with its honesty, its acknowledgement of futility. I had expected threats, demands, the same implacable insistence on her twisted logic of exchange. Instead, I heard something that sounded almost like wisdom, like the hard earned understanding that comes from years of pursuing a goal only to discover that achieving it brings no satisfaction. Then why continue? I asked. Why not let go? Why not accept that your child is gone and find peace in whatever realm awaits spirits who release their earthly attachments? She was quiet for a long moment, her pale form swaying slightly in the evening breeze. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. Because letting go means accepting that his death was meaningless, she said, that his short life counted for nothing, that the world can simply continue as if he never existed. At least in hunting for replacement, in demanding payment, in refusing to be acknowledged, at least in my persistence, he is not forgotten. And there, finally, I understood the true tragedy of our situation. She wasn't evil in the way I had always imagined evil to be: cold, calculating, deliberately malicious. Not. She was broken, lost in a grief so complete that she had confused activity with healing, had mistaken the temporary relief of action for genuine progress toward peace. Your Every mother who has ever lost a child carries his story. Every parent who holds their living children closer because they know how quickly life can be taken away honors his memory. You don't have to steal other children to keep him alive in the world. He lives on in every act of protection, every moment of grateful parenting, every prayer whispered by mothers who understand what you have lost. And she listened with the intensity of someone hearing a language they had almost forgotten but still dimly recognized. The dead child in her arms seemed to shift slightly, and for a moment I could almost see him as he must have been in life, not the gray, lifeless thing he had become in death, but a real baby with bright eyes and curious hands and all the potential that every newborn carries. But how do I let go? She asked, and the question was so human, so achingly familiar, that it brought tears to my eyes. How do I stop fighting death when fighting is all I have left? The same way every parent learns to let their children grow up, I said, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of trust, that love doesn't require possession, that memory doesn't require revenge. And what happened next was not dramatic in the way you might expect from such stories. There was no flash of light, no sudden transformation, no immediate revelation that changed everything in an instant. Instead, there was simply a gradual shift, like the way dawn comes to the sky, so slowly you don't notice it happening, but undeniable in its accumulation of light. She looked down at the child in her arms for a long time, really looked at him in a way I sensed she hadn't allowed herself to do for decades. And as she looked, he began to change. Gray pallor of his skin warmed slightly, taking on the peachy tones of healthy infancy. His limbs, which had hung loose and unnatural, seemed to relax into the normal postures of sleep. His face, which had been slack and empty, arranged itself into an expression of perfect contentment. For just a moment, he looked exactly as he must have looked in life: beautiful, innocent, whole. And in that moment, I think she finally saw him clearly, not as the vengeful tool he had become in death, but as the beloved child he had always been. She kissed his forehead with infinite tenderness, whispered something in a language I didn't recognize, and then let him go, Not physically, he didn't fall or disappear, but I could feel the moment when she released her desperate grip on his spirit, when she gave him permission to continue his journey to whatever lay beyond the realm of the living. He faded gradually, peacefully, like mist dissolving in sunlight. And as he disappeared, she began to change too, becoming more translucent, more ethereal, as if letting go of her earthly attachments was allowing her to return to whatever form spirits take when they are no longer fighting against the natural order of things. Thank you, she said, her voice now barely audible above the sound of water flowing over stones. Thank you for helping me remember what love looks like when it's not twisted by grief. And then weaving behind only the normal sounds of evening by the river water lapping against the banks, insects beginning their nightly chorus, the distant sound of families calling their children home for dinner. My granddaughter never saw the lady in white again. None of the children in our village have reported such encounters since that evening 20 years ago. The dogs no longer bark at shadows by the water, and the scent of frangipani only appears now when the actual trees bloom in their proper season. But the story doesn't end there, because the most important lessons are not about how to fight the darkness, but about how to prevent it from taking root in the first place. I have spent the decades since that final encounter teaching my children and grandchildren and their children about the difference between healthy grief and the kind of mourning that becomes a prison. I have shown them that remembering those we've lost doesn't require holding on to them so tightly that we forget to live our own lives. When my eldest granddaughter lost her first child to fever, I sat with her through the long nights of questioning and rage and desperate bargaining with forces beyond our control. I helped her find ways to honor her baby's memory that didn't involve refusing to accept his death. We planted a tree in his name, told stories about the brief time we had with him, created rituals of remembrance that celebrated his existence rather than raging against his absence. When my son's wife died in childbirth, I was there to help him navigate the terrible landscape of single parenthood, to show him that it was possible to grieve deeply while still remaining present for the children who needed him. I shared my own experiences of loss and recovery, not as wisdom to be followed exactly, but as evidence that survival was possible, that meaning could be rebuilt from the fragments of shattered dreams. And when death visits our family now, as it visits all families with the inevitable regularity of seasons, I help the survivors understand that the dead want peace for those they leave behind, not eternal suffering in their name. That love, expressed through living fully, is a more powerful memorial than love expressed through refusing to heal. This is why I tell you this story, not to frighten you with tales of supernatural revenge, but to help you understand the real dangers that face us all. The spirit who haunted our family for so many years was not unusual in her grief. She was unusual only in her power to act on that grief in ways that transcended death. All of us carry the capacity for that kind of destructive mourning. All of us have the potential to become so lost in what we have lost that we forget to treasure what we still have. All of us risk allowing our pain to become a weapon we turn against the very people we claim to be protecting. The river that runs past our village is the same river that has always been here. It gives life to our crops, provides fish for our tables, carries away the waste that would otherwise poison our community. But it can also flood, destroy, take life as the difference is not in the river itself, but in how we choose to live alongside it. We build our houses on stilts to survive the floods. We teach our children to respect the water's power while not being paralyzed by fear of it. We learn the seasonal patterns that tell us when it's safe to fish and when it's wise to. We take what it offers gratefully while remembering that it owes us nothing, that our safety depends on understanding its nature rather than trying to. The same wisdom applies to grief, to loss, to all the experiences that have the potential to either destroy us or teach us to live more fully. We must learn to live alongside these forces without being swept away by them, to respect their power without being paralyzed by fear, to take what lessons they offer while remembering that our healing depends on understanding their nature rather than trying to control them. I am old now, older than I ever expected to become when I was that young mother crouched by the river's edge, terrified by things I couldn't understand. My hair is white, my hands are spotted with age, and my back aches when the rains come. But I am still here, still telling stories, still helping younger generations navigate the complexities of loving and losing in a world that offers no guarantees. My children have children of their own now, and those children are beginning to have children. Our family has spread along the riverbank like a tree sending out new branches, each generation reaching further while staying rooted in the same soil that nourished their ancestors. And yes, we have lost people along the way. Death comes to every family, takes grandparents and parents, and sometimes heartbreakingly children. But we have learned to grieve cleanly, to mourn completely, to let go when letting go becomes an act of love rather than abandonment. The river still flows past our doors, carrying its cargo of silt and fish and fallen leaves toward the distant sea. Children still play in its shallows during the dry season, and women still gather on its banks to wash clothes and share the day's news. But we approach it now with the kind of respectful awareness that comes from understanding both its gifts and its dangers. Sometimes on very quiet evenings when the water runs especially clear, I think I can see shadows moving beneath the surface, not spirits or ghosts, but simply the memory of all the lives that have touched this place, all the stories that have unfolded along these banks. And they are not haunting us, they are simply part of the landscape now, woven into the fabric of our community's history, like threads in a tapestry that grows richer and more complex with each passing generation. People sometimes ask me if I believe the spirit found peace, if she really moved on to whatever realm awaits the dead when they finally release their earthly attachments. I tell them that I hope so, but that the more important question is whether we, the living, have learned to find peace with the mysteries that surround us. We cannot know what happens to consciousness after death. We cannot control the forces that take our loved ones from us or prevent the random cruelties that sometimes visit even the most careful, loving families. But we can choose how we respond to these unknowns, how we allow them to shape our relationships with those who are still with us. The greatest tragedy would not be if the spirit still wanders somewhere, searching for a peace that eludes her. The greatest tragedy would be if we learn nothing from her example, if we continue to mistake the intensity of our pain for the depth of our love, if we allowed our grief to become a barrier between ourselves and the living world that still needs our attention. I have watched families destroy themselves with feuds that outlast the memories of what caused them. I have seen parents so consumed with mourning dead children that they neglected the living ones who still needed their care. I have witnessed communities tear themselves apart with suspicions and accusations born from the simple human need to blame someone, anyone, for losses that no one could have prevented. These are the real hauntings that plague our world, not the supernatural visitations of restless spirits, but the all too natural tendency to let past pain overwhelm present possibility. These are the ghosts that actually have the power to steal our futures, to drain the joy from our days, to turn love into a weapon we use against those we claim to be protecting. So when loss comes to your family, and it will come because that is the nature of loving mortal beings in a world where nothing lasts forever, remember this: the dead do not benefit from our refusal to heal. They are not honored by our inability to find meaning in their absence. They are not kept alive by our determination to suffer in their name. What honors the dead is how fully we live, how gratefully we love those who remain, how generously we offer the lessons we've learned to others who are just beginning their own journeys through loss and recovery. What keeps their memory alive is not the intensity of our mourning, but the quality of our living, the way we treat our children with the tenderness we wish we could still offer them, the way we appreciate ordinary moments with the perspective that comes from knowing how quickly such moments can be taken away, the way we choose hope over despair, even when despair seems more justified by the evidence. The river that remembers is not just the water that flows past our village. It is the continuous stream of human experience that connects us to those who came before and those who will come. It carries our stories downstream to future generations, just as it brought us the stories of our ancestors who faced the same essential challenges of loving and losing, of finding meaning in the face of uncertainty, of choosing life even when death seems to have the final word. And sometimes when I'm sitting by the water in the evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains and listening to my great grandchildren playing under the houses, I think I can feel her presence again. Not the desperate, demanding spirit who haunted us for so many years, but something gentler, a whisper of gratitude, a sense of completion, the peaceful awareness of someone who has finally learned to let go. I like to imagine that she is at rest now, reunited with her child in whatever realm awaits those who die with their love intact, rather than twisted by unresolved grief. I like to think that our conversation by the river all those years ago helped her remember what she had forgotten in her decades of haunting, that love's greatest expression is often the willingness to release what we cannot keep, to bless what we cannot control, to find peace in the knowledge that some connections transcend the boundaries of life and death without requiring us to refuse the reality of either. But whether or not our family learned to honor the dead by living fully, to remember those we've lost by treasuring those we still have, to face the river's mysteries with respect and that in the end is the most important part of any story, not how it begins or even how it ends, but how it teaches us to live better in the middle, in the long stretches of ordinary time, when we have the opportunity to choose wisdom over folly, love over fear, hope over despair. The river still flows. The village still dreams. Children still play in the shallows when the water runs clear and gentle. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, between the stories we tell and the lives we live, the dead and the living find ways to coexist without destroying each other. That is all any of us can ask for. That is all any of us can give. The river remembers everything, but it also lets everything go, carrying each moment downstream to make room for the next. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson it has to teach us, not how to hold on, but how to let flow.